She stepped down from the rickety truck with one suitcase and a name the road had not known before: Elena de la Vega. March dust rose at her boots and pooled in the folds of her skirt. The sun had the thin, wary heat of a season reluctant to change. Behind her, the highway led back to a city that had taken everything. Furniture gone, creditors' hands prying at memory. And in front of her, beyond the gate of Tres Arroyos, lay a house that kept its own sorrows like a closed book. If this story moves you, tell us where you're listening from and subscribe for more tales like this. She stood for a moment under the wooden arch and watched the hacienda, as if it might speak first. Tres Arroyos was larger than the neighbor farms. Broad eaves, a porch that ran the length of its face, a line of pepper trees, and an orchard that smelled faintly of fermenting fruit. The estate looked as if it had been built around certain silences. A child's chair missing from the porch, shutters kept half closed, a swing that no one used. Elena set her reticule upon the ground and opened her suitcase with hands that had learned to be careful. Inside, wrapped in a scrap of blue cloth, lay her grandmother's ring, an oval of old gold with a faintly clouded stone. She touched it before she closed the lid, like testing a small, private truth. She had left the city because there was nothing left to hold her there. Her father had been a man with debts deeper than the books had shown. Shame had come like a fever. When the town constable knocked and the bailiff's cart took the last of their furniture, there had been a note folded inside the locked bureau, his handwriting looping and uneven. Elena carried that unread page with her all the way to the truck. She had read it only once, late into the night, when the room smelled of boiled coffee and burned bread. Her father's hand had trembled over the ink. He had spoken of failure, of not wanting his daughter to watch the creditors take everything. He asked her, in the final sentences that still trembled in her memory, to go where she might find work and keep her name clean. After that, he cut the cord her family had been tied to and left his daughter to answer what remained. She was not a child without education. Elena could read the debt ledgers and she could sign a polite letter. She could boil down complex complaints to crisp sentences and make an argument that was not shrill. That education was her tool, and her exile both. In the city, a woman of her station would not be expected to carry a water pail, to scrub a hearth, to direct laborers. But what remained when every roof and creditor's stare had driven her out was the unwillingness to believe herself without value. The suitcase contained more than clothes. It held rule books of household management, letters of recommendation from a cousin who taught in Merida, and a careful economy of hope. Doña Candida met her at the gate. The housekeeper was all apron and resolute welcome, a woman with hands as sure as any farmer's, and a laugh that folded the air to make room for newcomers. She took Elena's suitcase and set it on the porch as if it were the most natural thing in the world, and Elena found herself breathing easier. There was a kettle on the hearth and a loaf of bread half sliced on the table. The smell of cumin and onions spoke of regular domestic life, tasks and time that made sense when the rest of the world did not. "You are welcome," Doña Candida said, and in that voice a whole county of quiet hospitality opened. She did not ask questions at once. She introduced names slowly, as if names were buttons that needed to be pressed in a certain order. "You will sleep in the west room. There is soup in the pot. Rafael will know by lunchtime whether we keep you." Rafael Almagro did not appear at the first ring of the bell. He had become, in the gossip of the valley, a man who answered only when necessary. The story that accompanied his silence was younger than his grief, that his wife Isabel had died 2 winters past. That with her went the light from the house. Men called Rafael a good man because he paid his laborers, because he sheltered the families of the valley in times of poor harvest, because he kept his word on debts. He was wealthy in the strict provincial sense. Land, horses, the solid chest of a man who could afford to feed others. But he was also a widower of certain design, deliberate in his movements, private in his grief, a man who had set his life to the rhythm of duties rather than pleasures. Their first meeting might have been nothing, a curt exchange of names and instructions. Instead, it was a small, tightly held thing. Elena lifting her hat in the dim light of the hallway, Rafael looking up from the ledger he had been pretending to close, and both of them measuring the distance between them, with a politeness born of necessity. He was taller than she had imagined and narrower in his gestures. The face that examined her first was a map of restraint. Set jaw, eyes that watched without betraying. His voice when he spoke was low and even. "We need hands," he said. "We pay what we can." "I can cook, I can mend," she replied. Her voice felt steadier to her than the hands that had closed around the suitcase. She had practiced the simplicity of what she could offer. She did not explain the reasons she had come. It was enough for the moment that she had come. Doña Candida showed her the work as if it were a pattern to be learned. There were measures and times, tacks and recipes, rituals for oiling hinges and the right place to leave fresh water for a man who would not ask. Elena fell into the days as much as she was able. Mornings were for the fields, for sweeping the porch and setting out breakfast. Afternoons were for mending and reading aloud when an old laborer needed a legal form explained. Evenings were for the stove and for thinking. The men at Tres Arroyos watched her with a kind of honest curiosity that pleased her more than she expected. Tonio, who tended the granary, tipped his cap and offered jokes about city manners that were more fondness than mockery. Pedro, who had been Raphael's foreman for many years, took a minute to show her where the wells were and how to tell a horse's mood by the tilt of its ears. Don Joaquin, the blacksmith, asked once if she could read the periodicals in the market, and then left with news of a judge's arrival in the next town. These were small exchanges that made a life possible. They were stitches. Elena learned to carry water without spilling, to lay bread on the table that smelled of warmth rather than obligation. Raphael watched without fully joining. He rose before dawn and walked the rows, his boots sinking into damp earth, his sleeves rolled to the elbows. He fixed fences, sometimes without asking help, as if the act of mending a broken board could repair a feeling he could not name. He gave seeds to a neighbor whose crop had failed and paid a debt for a widow without seeking recognition. To some he offered a pocket of flour or a sack of corn. To others, he gave the steadiness of a man who kept count. People respected him, sometimes with gratitude and sometimes with a kind of wary awe. He was the sort of man the valley told its stories about, someone who would stand in for fairness when it was needed. Elena noticed small things before anyone pointed them out. She saw how Raphael hesitated over photographs left on the mantel, how his gaze would go to a sunroom curtain where Isabel used to sit, and then slip away as if embarrassed at his own longing. She watched him oil a rusted hinge with the slow, careful hands of someone who had learned to do physical work in order to keep his mind from wandering into sorrow. Once, in the yellow light of an afternoon, she found him on the porch with a book he could not open to read aloud. He looked at the lines for a long time, and then closed the cover, as if the act of pausing were a form of prayer. Between them there was a grammar of small services. She brought hot water for his boots without asking. He left an extra ration of tobacco wrapped in paper when he noticed the storeroom running low. A flower turned up in a cracked jar on the kitchen table, as if someone had believed in a sudden joy. Elena learned how to speak around his silences rather than into them. Raphael learned how to accept a cup of tea without appearing to need the comfort. The suitcase was a constant companion in her mind. At night, when she lay in the small west room that looked out over the orchard, she would sit on the edge of the bed and lay the open suitcase on her knees. The ring, her grandmother's ring, was small and warm in the palm of her hand, an anchor for a woman in motion. She thought of her father's note sometimes as a formal thing, and sometimes as a raw wound. The ring was the only inheritance that made sense to keep, because it was less about wealth and more about a promise. That whatever the world removed would not entirely remove what had taught her to be herself. Doña Candida saw the ring one evening by the lamp as Elena folded shirts. "Keep it close," she said, as if naming a law. "An object like that gives a woman strength." There was no pity in her voice, only recognition. Elena smiled and slipped the ring to a finger for a minute, feeling its cool weight. The seasons turned in soft increments. Work, sleep, bread. The land rewarded time. When the rains came, the fields gave back fat stalks. When heat pressed, men sat in the shade and spoke of price lists, and whether the commissario would finally come to collect a statement from Don Cristobal about the burnt fence. Life at Tres Arroyos was a rhythm that soothed what had been torn. Then the sky darkened like a secret about to be told. It began as a distance of wings. The birds fell silent an hour before the first clouds gathered, and even the dogs grew quieter, uneasy as if they had a premonition. A wind rose, worrying at the edges of the orchard, and the men were slow to speak. Farmers know weather in their joints and in the rustle of a leaf. Afternoon smeared into a thick, low light. Clouds clustered like a flock of black wool. Doña Candida called everyone to the porch to brace shutters and check roofs. Rain at the hacienda could be mercy or menace, and that afternoon it arrived with a violence that surprised even the old hands. The rain came down in sheets, at first like a dozen hoses turned on at once. The porch became a place of breathing, the heavy drumming on the tiles, the smell of wet earth rising like steam from the orchard. Elena hurried with hot soup, water, and blankets. Raphael went out once to the granary and came back with mud up to his boots, and a look that was almost wild. He had been in the fields when the downpour began, hauling a tarp over a newly planted row. The wind had turned and slapped him with sharp, cold needles. He had a small cut along his palm, where a nail had caught the leather of a glove. In that storm, matters that had been kept tidy by distance became urgent. A loose beam in the storeroom threatened to fall. A gutter overflowed and sent a cascade down into a corner where sacks of seed sat. Men moved with directness. There was no time for ceremony. Elena found herself at Raphael's side, steadying a ladder with a voice that was sure despite the rain and the danger. He accepted her help in a way that surprised him. He did not ask. He did not withdraw. He simply allowed the support to happen, as if it were an obvious and necessary exchange. When he came down, the cut on his hand had bled through the cloth he had wrapped. The sight of the red dark on the white made Elena's chest tighten. She took his hand and brought it into the kitchen, where Doña Candida washed the wound with water that smelled faintly of herbs. Raphael's face had the look of a man who had been startled into youth by pain. For a moment his mask slipped, and the man under it was present. Mortality, weariness, and the strange relief of having someone else see him. "Hold still," Elena said, not quite sounding like a woman addressing a superior. She tied the bandage with a knot she had learned for fishing lines, the knot of someone who had to make things hold. Raphael's breath was shallow. He watched her as she worked, the corner of his mouth almost relaxed. "That will do," Doña Candida said. "You are no surgeon, but you're no stranger to hands." Raphael looked at Elena then, as if measuring whether a person could be trusted with more than a bandage. He touched the cut with the gentlest of fingers, not to test pain, but to confirm reality. The storm made windows rattle and the kettle whistle. Outside, a tree banged its limbs against a fence and a lantern guttered. The house felt small and exact, a vessel in which two people discovered the outlines of one another. Later that evening, when the rain had lessened to a steady whisper and lantern light burned a soft halo in the kitchen, they found themselves on the porch with a blanket between them, the world paired to the sound of drip and the smell of wet wood. Raphael had a cup of tea he had not asked for but accepted, and Elena sat with her hands wrapped around her own cup, watching him as if he were a map that might finally open. Words were sparse, they had become extravagant, so they spoke in other things. He told her about a place Isabel had liked in the orchard, a small bend in the path where the wild thyme grew, and the air tasted of honey in late summer. He spoke of planting a sapling near the granary for a son he had never had, not with bitterness, but with a careful, tender resignation. Elena listened and spoke back in the way softer truths are told, with questions, with small laughter, with silence that answered. She did not try to name his grief or to fix it. She offered instead the steadiness of presence. She spoke quietly of books she had read, of a teacher in Merida who had once told her that a person's work can be a prayer, that mending a hem and mending a fence were of the same family. Raphael smiled at that, a small thing that loosened something around his mouth. Their hands touched first by accident, over the blanket in the motion of reaching for the teapot, and then on purpose, as if both had agreed to make another test. The touch was an economy of gestures, no words, no great promises, but an exchange. Elena's fingers brushed the scab on Raphael's palm and found a map of old habit and new injury. He did not flinch. He kept his hand in hers, not holding back and not pushing forward. For him, the moment was a fissure in the wall he had built. For her, it was both a breach and an invitation. Each knew the rules of caution, her dignity, his grief, the watchful eyes of the valley that could misconstrue patience for impropriety. Yet in the rain-washed hush of Tres Arroyos, they chose something simpler, a truth that did not press for explanation. When the surge of closeness made speech inadequate, Raphael leaned forward and kissed her forehead. It was an old-fashioned, protective gesture, gentler than a pledge and more intimate than a farewell. Elena closed her eyes and let herself be steadied. The gesture was both a benediction and a confession. It said what men and women in that place did not say across tables and ledgers, that they were tired of standing alone. They sat like that for some time, listening to the house breathe. The town beyond their fields had no more knowledge of the small, slow reweaving taking place under Tres Arroyos' eaves than it had of the weather. The kettle nodded in its corner, steam curling like a whisper. It would not be easy, this thing between them. There would be accusations, there would be gossip, there would be the lasting imprint of Isabel's absence in picture frames and in a chair kept for her on the sun porch. But in that dim, warm hour, the landscape between grief and trust moved a few degrees, and the two who had kept it steady discovered a soft collective pulse. Elena thought of her father then, of the note folded in the bureau, of the suitcase with its careful economy. She thought how she had come to Tres Arroyos not to be rescued but to work, how, in the small work of mending and cooking and keeping count, she had found a quiet way to remain herself. She thought of the ring in her pocket. She had slid it onto her finger that evening, letting the gold sit warm against skin, and she felt the weight of the promise that object carried. It was not a pledge of wealth, but of continuity, an emblem that her life could be traced across years. Raphael watched the stone in the light, and then looked to where the orchard's outlines shimmered beyond the lantern glow. "You will not be satisfied with the kitchen," he said then, half a question, half a warning. "You read papers. You will say things aloud when the valley needs them." "I will," she said, and the certainty in her voice surprised her. She did not know yet how she would turn words into action. She only knew the truth she was newly allowed to say. The land needed more than bread. It needed voices that would not be frightened by men who made demands. They were both learning how to accept what the other offered: solace, work, challenge. The hush of the house held a fragile promise. Outside, the rain stilled to a low drum. The orchard smelled of leaves and a lingering green rain. Before sleep took them both in different rooms with different thoughts, a sound reached them through the shutters. A car, or rather the echo of an engine that did not belong to the slow, farmed roads. It came from the direction of Don Cristobal's place, and it had an urgency to it, a low, metallic note that suggested wheels and men who meant to be noticed. They both listened. The sound did not belong to gentlefolk. It was the kind of intrusion a valley learned to dread. Raphael rose, his movement efficient, and for a moment the lodgings of tenderness were shelled by duty. He stepped to the door and looked out into the rain dark beyond the porch. Someone had been down the lane. Someone had passed by Tres Arroyos and left a trace. Raphael did not speak at first. He only watched the road, the place where the land met what it feared. "Should I wake the men?" Elena asked. Raphael looked at her then, and for the first time in days his eyes were steady with resolve rather than with tiredness. "No," he said softly. "Not yet. Let us watch." They held vigil together in the storm's aftermath, two figures on the porch beneath a wet sky. Inside the house, the kettle clicked and the lamp burned low. The suitcase sat closed in Elena's room, a tender weight of past and future. The ring on her finger glinted as she crossed her hands on her lap. From the road, indistinct, came the sound of voices gathering. A man's laugh too loud for weather, the scrape of a boot, then silence. In the hush that followed, they felt the valley's history tighten around them, the long pattern of men who came to take what they wanted and of the other men who, quietly and stubbornly, refused to yield. The choice in the air was not between two lovers and a quiet life. It was between standing still under the shelter of grief and opening up, then using what they had gathered, education, wealth, community, to protect the small, stubborn life nurtured in their care. Elena slid the ring stone between her thumb and forefinger, as if counting the small faces the future might bring, and Raphael moved to the porch rail, listening for footsteps that might mean only a neighbor's need, or might mean a shadow with dangerous intent. The night closed, and they waited at the threshold of what would be demanded of them. Dawn light found the orchard scrubbed and glossy with last night's rain. Footprints cut into clay paths showed the direction of the visitor's passage. By morning, the county's small world had begun to stir with worry. Don Cristobal's cart arrived late, wheels dragging, the old man's face ashen with a fear that did not suit his usual stubbornness. He spoke in short, broken sentences. The fence went up in flames in the night. A hand-thrown torch, a smell of oil that would not wash away. His store of seed had been singed at one corner. A tethered mule had been cut free. A neighbor's barn had scorch marks that would take weeks to salt out of memory. The valley's instincts turned the way a river turns to a newly opened channel, toward Tres Arroyos, and toward the man who had most openly shielded the small farms. Damasco's name was not shouted. It was spoken with the gravity of a prayer against bad weather. People remembered how the colonel had once, in a shrewd manner, purchased an indebted parcel under the guise of charity. They remembered the talk of his men, tall, loose-jawed figures who lingered near auctions and leaned on fences as if the land were their own warrant. Fear was not only for property, it was for the shape a small community takes when a man with a uniform decides to turn greed into an instrument. Raphael moved as if duty had a weight to it. He rode to Don Cristobal's with Pedro and Tonio, boots splashing in the sticky mud, faces set. Elena, who had not been invited to ride at first, there were lines even grief had not eroded, went anyway, gripping her reticule as if it were an emblem. Doña Candida did not argue. In the silence of the cart, the old housekeeper handed Elena a small cloth-wrapped parcel of bread. "For the road," she said, "and because you will be needed." At the burned fence, Raphael examined the blackened posts with the kind of attention a man gives a broken hinge. Patient, searching for the mechanism of ruin. He crouched and ran a finger along charred wood. "This was set to start," he said, and the men around him nodded. It was not a stray spark. It had been arranged to spread fear. "No one saw faces?" Elena asked. She kept the voice even. She had learned by now that a hand too loud could frighten the truth away. "Footprints to the lane and then gone," Don Cristobal said. "Like the men walked soft through the orchard. Someone came by with oil in a can." Raphael stood and looked at the valley that had come to the fence. Neighbors clustered in coats damp with early rain. The blacksmith with coal still in his hair. A washerwoman with flour on her hands. Watching them, he felt a thing he had not named before. Not merely responsibility, but an anger that was a kind of warmth. If a man's life is the sum of the things he refuses to leave undone, then trespassing on other people's livelihoods was one more wrong he meant to make right. That afternoon a man arrived from the town proper. A courier on a spring cart carrying a folded sheet of paper bearing the provincial paper's masthead. Elena had sent a letter the night before, her hand steady with no flourish, detailing the pattern of threats and the sense of fear. She had dated it, signed it with her full name, and had asked a friend in Merida to deliver it to a newspaperman who knew how to listen to country grief. The carriage that came brought more than inked words. It brought a small reporter, a man with a camera, a curious new thing in a valley used only to the fixed, reverent gaze of painted images, and a mind that liked stories that had both cruelty and courage. The journalist's article, published within days in the provincial column under a headline that suggested scandal rather than mere nuisance, spread like a hard seed. It gave names to things people had only whispered. The coronel's ambitions for land consolidation, his men's pattern of using fire and threat to buy out frightened owners, the local officials who turned a blind eye because fear was cheaper than a fight. The piece did not shout. It laid out facts with the soft insistence of someone who had read the ledger and found it wrong. It named Tres Arroyos as a refuge, and its owner as a man who would not see neighbors broken into the bread of the earth. The name Damasco appeared, fierce and precise. The valley's hum changed after the article. Where before people had folded inward, now they stood straighter, shy with a new kind of courage. Fathers took their sons to the fields to show them how to mend burned rails. Women met in kitchens and wrote witness statements on scraps of paper. Don Joaquin closed his shop long enough to go and file an affidavit. The comisario, who had been slow and cautious because his job was small, and his life subject to the large man's shadow, felt the lightness and then the weight of attention. To do nothing now would be indecent and visible. Padre Tomas, who kept the bell ropes taut in the church tower and the county's conscience hanging by his sermon, spoke from the pulpit of stewardship and the sin of taking what is not given. His sermon was not a threat but a line drawn with moral chalk. The community had been called to bear witness. When the first act of true violence came, it was at the edge of dawn and aimed at the town's boldest. Don Cristobal's barn, which had stood stubbornly by his family's life, was set alight in the hour before rooster call. Flames ate at a corner, and for a terrifying span, licked along straw and rafter. People ran with buckets, a hand-to-hand alliance against a thing meant to intimidate. Elena felt the smoke in her throat and the sting of two men's hands as they passed water to one another. She did not watch from a safe distance. She accepted a bucket and lent her shoulders to the chain. The fire was fought not by one great man but by many small hands, and by the refusal of the valley to let itself be frightened back into silence. Raphael stood at the center like a fixed beam. He helped pass pails. He found the hose that did connect to a cistern and ordered men to the windward side. In a moment when a burning rafter fell with a smart crack that made the crowd flinch, he pushed, with Jared-shouldered steadiness, a neighbor out of the way and took a char on his forearm from a falling ember. The pain was a hot, immediate ledger, unlike the long-term costs of grief. Elena saw it and saw him stagger, hand pressed to the wound, and she moved as she had the night of the rain without questioning. Later, when the smoke had been beaten into a guilty memory, and the barn's charred bones smoldered, some men wanted to ride at once and do the sort of justice that ends loudly and badly. But Elena remembered the article and Padre Tomas's words. She remembered the ledger of law printed across her training. She remembered that a community that loses its patience can lose its claim to righteousness. She went to Raphael and spoke softly while the crowd chewed the silence left by the fire. "We cannot answer with gunfire," she said. "Not yet. We must make the law feel the heat of what happened. We must show with paper and witness that this is not a private quarrel, but a public crime." Raphael looked at her with the look he reserved for things that required more than force, the look of a man calibrating resistance to goodness. "You mean gather sworn statements," he said. "Yes." Elena's voice held the flat certainty of a blade being drawn. "We get Padre Tomas to take the declarations. We take them to the comisario and demand that an inquiry be opened. We invite the judge to inspect, and we make sure the paper prints the names and the facts and not just gossip." He had expected her to offer courage, perhaps to mend bandages or cook for the exhausted. Instead, she gave him a legal map. He accepted it as a man accepts a rope in swift water. "Find Don Joaquin," he said. "Get his witness. Bring the list to me, and I will carry it to comisaria myself." So Elena set about the work with hands that knew how to fold cloth and fold arguments. She sat with the washerwomen and scribbled their evidence, times and sounds, lights in the lane at midnight, the men who had demanded to know why old Cristobal had not sold his last acre. She wrote letters with her clear hand, copies to the newspaper, the judge, and a named comisario. She rode into town on Don Joaquin's cart with proofs bounding on her lap, her reticule pressed tight to her chest like a small, stubborn passport. The comisario, who had become less hesitant as the story known in ink filled the valley, summoned the judge. A formal inquiry was called at Tres Arroyos, not in the commissaria's dusty room, but under the broad eaves of Raphael's porch, because the place had become neutral ground, a house with a reputation for shelter, and a man who had more weight with neighbors than any formal title. The judge arrived with robes unadorned, and a face that had also been schooled in gentility. He listened as people spoke, and Elena felt the fine tremor that runs through every system of law. Evidence is only as strong as the courage of witnesses. Padre Tomas took his seat at the long trestle table, his hands a small compass of kindness. He had collected testimonies and had pressed men to speak with clarity rather than rumor. Don Cristobal stood, trembling with the kind of old fury that is less about revenge than the indignity of the things that touch you. He pointed to the charred fence and the scorch on his barn and said, "He told me to sell. He tried to buy the ground through fear." Rafael watched Damasco's name move through the room like a knife. When the comisario read the sworn depositions, signed in shaky, courageous ink, Elena felt as if the valley were stitching itself together with writing. There were details that could be verified. The smell of oil on a rag, the footprints leading to the lane, a scrap of cloth left behind that matched the uniform slack of one of Damasco's men. Don Joaquin produced a statement noting that he had once heard Damasco tell another man to make offers they cannot refuse, and a blacksmith declared that his apprentice had seen Damasco's henchmen prowling near Cristobal's property under cover of dark. Damasco arrived with the slithering surety of a man who had been used to not being believed, and then finding he was. He did not come with glinting weapons. He came with a smile meant to smooth. He offered the judge an elegant version of the truth, that these were misunderstandings, that in matters of land sometimes tempers fray. His voice was honeyed. So too was the man's way of leaving his threats half-phrased, so that their bite remained. Yet the tapestry of testimony had been carefully woven. People had not merely spoken. They had shown charred timbers and a can that smelled of kerosene and tools, marked by Damasco's men's peculiar initials. The reporter's article had already carved a public witness into the margin. Now law and community converged. The judge, whose authority depended on being seen to act, found it prudent to issue orders. A search, arrests if necessary, and subpoenas for those men named in the affidavits. The comisario nodded. It was the beginning of a formal dance that required the law's steps and the community's pressure to keep time. If Damasco had expected an easy closure, he found instead the slow machinery of civic scrutiny. Men who had formerly accepted his favors now kept their distance. The henchmen who had boasted on the plaza of their immunity began to avoid each other. Small cruelties demanded a public reckoning, and the reckoning came. In the days that followed, 2 of Damasco's men were detained for questioning. The judge convened a search that brought to light burned fragments. Evidence was catalogued in the presence of witnesses. The coronel's influence, which had seemed as thick as the land itself, frayed in the face of combined light. Newspapers, priests, judges, and the thin, steady thread of 25 villagers risked against the hard thing of one powerful man. In the midst of the legal work, the personal thread between Rafael and Elena continued to weave itself in the hush of routine. When Rafael's forearm blistered from the falling ember, Elena washed the wound with the care of someone who had learned how to unflinch at pain. She set salve on the burned skin with practiced fingers, bound it with a strip of linen, and sat with him while the ache settled into a map of tenderness. "You carry other people's burdens like they are your own," she said once when the house was emptied of the day's paperwork. "And you carry my foolishness as if it is worth the bearing," he replied. "You tell me to wait and then act as if waiting itself is violence." She laughed softly, a sound like someone opening windows. "I tell you to be clever because you are strong," she said. "Strength without care is only a weight that will sink what it holds." Those evenings, they talked more freely. He took her into the study he had kept locked for Isabel's things, a room that smelled of cedar and of another time, and showed her the careful stacks of letters tied with ribbon, the pressed herbarium Isabel had kept, the photograph of a summer where Isabel laughed with a shawl over her head. Raphael's voice was quieter there, and his confessions came as if from a man learning to remove armor. "I have been afraid," he said once, turning a page of a ledger like he turned the truth. "Afraid that to love again would be disloyal to her memory, or that to try would be a weakness that people would use against me." Elena watched him as the light in the study made his cheekbones severe. "Isabel's memory would have wanted you alive," she said. "And love is not a betrayal of the past. It is a way of carrying it forward." He listened, and after a long time he let a smile come that felt almost boyish. He took a small, careful breath and reached for the ring in his vest, the ring that had belonged to his grandmother. A simple circlet of gold, worn soft by decades of use, its face marked by years. He had meant to keep it as a private talisman, a thing to remember family by. Now he took it and set it in Elena's palm. "It has no great value," he said. "Only weight. It belonged to a woman who taught me to fix what was broken. If you will let my family be a place where you rest, it is yours to keep." Elena felt the weight of that gesture as if a current had run between them. She took the ring and pressed it into the flat of her hand. For a moment they were both children, and both elders, two souls trading a promise that had no grand flourish, but the honest fact of making a life together. The ring was small and warm, a circle with no end. Yet the valley's fight was not yet done. There were threats that could not be measured only in tattered property or eyelashes of smoke. One evening, a carriage bearing two masked men known in whispers as Damasco's trusted, rolled into the lane and left a note tacked in a public place. "Sell your land or live with fire." The message was an attempt at terror, the kind that thrives on the slow creep of doubt. The community did not bend. If fear had been the coronel's blade, the valley decided to dull it with tools as ordinary as testimony and as public as a sermon. Padre Tomas rang the bell and called for a meeting of parishioners. They gathered in a full church with hands that had dug and sewn and mended. Elena stood and read a statement that named the crimes and asked for formal protection. She read with a voice that never shook. The good people signed, one by one, as if signatures were a line connecting them together, a net. The commissario pledged his presence. The judge pledged to hear complaints. The reporter's second article printed the town's signatures and the facts once more, and when papers from the city carried the story into the hands of men who would usually shrug, it became uncomfortable to ignore. Confrontation came then not in a burst of violence but in a day arranged with a legal air. A tribunal convened in the small municipal hall. Damasco, who had thought his shadow would be enough, arrived with a retinue of lawyers and a posture controlled by the assumption he was owed deference. The room was small. The judge presided with the steady hand of a man who had read the law and wished to be seen honoring it. Padre Tomas sat beside Elena as moral witness. Don Joaquin and Don Cristobal and others sat with dirt in their fingernails and the fire behind them as a mark of injuries. Testimony was given. Witnesses recounted the night of the fire, the scent of oil, the exchange on the lane. The scrap of cloth matching Damasco's man's coat was offered. The blackened fragments taken from Don Cristobal's barn were shown. The reporter's published account, an external echo, was read aloud into the record. Damasco's defense was loud with indignation and lawyery eloquence. But each time he spoke, someone produced a fact that snapped the loose thread of the speech. The judge, who had no stomach for law and disorder in his county, felt the public impulse as much as the legal one. He summoned the commissario to issue warrants. He ordered for the first time that year that the coronel's men be questioned fully. The commissario, who had feared for his job and his life when Damasco's boot had pressed upon him, now felt the weight of a community's eye and acted. Men were arrested for questioning. The coronel's men dwindled in number as the law's machinery took hold. Damasco, whose power had seldom required explanation, found his options shrinking. He attempted to bully still at the edges, but the chain he had relied on, fear, small corruption, quiet threats, had been exposed to light. When the judge, with the gravity of someone who had always believed the law to be more than a document, pronounced that an inquiry would proceed and that restitution and penalties would be set if guilt were established, the coronel's face reddened for the first time in public. He had not anticipated a valley willing to witness in ink and in oath. There was a moment when Damasco, trapped by the law and the press, considered leaving. He had spent his life pushing to own what he could, but ownership's pleasures are small when the rest of the world refuses to look aside. In the end, he did not go quietly. He fought in whispers and in threats, but his men had been named. His deeds had paper attached, and a judge had a pen. It was not a triumph that erased the past. It was a hard, tidy thing called justice beginning to make its way through mess. When order came, it was not dramatic. A summons, a brief custody, a fine for damages, and a requirement to publicly apologize or face more formal penalties. The judge arranged for aid to be given to Don Cristobal to repair the barn and for the county to open an investigation into the coronel's purchases of land under suspicious terms. It was imperfect but real. It was the legal world. Slow, enamel pale, and certain. The valley recognized the victory as something earned by careful, patient work, rather than by heroics. It was after the hearing, when the air itself seemed relieved of a heavy thought, that Raphael and Elena walked the orchard together. The afternoon sun made the peach trees glow, and the scent of newly turned earth felt like a benediction. Don Joaquin waved from the yard. Antonio whistled as he strung new fencing. The children of the valley played in the far field where last spring had been a burned edge. Raphael stopped near the old porch rail, where the wood had been sanded in places by hands that came and went. He sat and drew Elena to stand beside him. They did not speak immediately. The easy presence of a world at peace for a moment was their companion. Then, with an awkwardness that was honest and human, Raphael took Elena's hand. He held it as if to make sure the world had not merely been a relief of paper and law, but a change in the marrow. "Elena," he said, voice low in the orchard hush, "I have kept things boxed in my heart as if by locking them I might preserve the best. Isabel, the ledger of my life, the shape of the house. But what you have taught me is that to keep someone means to risk losing them as well. I would rather live and risk loss than sit so safe and watch everything I love burn." She looked at him then, and for a long moment each saw the map of the other. Grief, courage, the careful way of living. "You have given us a shelter," she said, "not merely of roofs and rules, but of example. You've made people brave, Raphael. You allowed others to rely on you." He smiled then, a small, steadying thing. From the pocket of his vest he drew out the ring he had once offered in the study, his grandmother's gold circlet that had carried the light of long days. He had kept it safe, polished like an instrument. Elena felt the small catch in her throat that happens when a door opens and you see what is beyond. "If you will take it," he said, "and if you will be my wife not because you must but because you want to, then I will break the last of my solitude with the sound of your voice beside me." She felt the weight of the choice not as a burden, but as the rightness of two tracks joining into one. She thought of the suitcase on the bed in her little west room, how it had once been everything and now seemed less a vessel than a memory, how the ring in her pocket had kept her steady on nights when the city had seemed like an accusation. She also thought of the valley, of Don Cristobal rebuilding, of Padre Tomas ringing church bells with a new clarity. To say yes was to be part of a life reborn not in spectacle, but in slow things. She put her hand to her mouth for a moment, a small private ceremony, and then she took his ring with the steadiness she had always reserved for practical matters. "Yes," she said. Their first kiss as a couple was small and kept to themselves. No crowd, no flourish. On the porch rail with late sun gilding the orchard. It was an affirmation rather than a consummation, the press of lips soft and sure, a promise without show. Around them life kept being village life, mending, sewing, talking, but the arc of what was held between them had shifted. The wedding was not grand. It needed not be. In the small church where Padre Tomas had married neighbors' children for decades, the pews filled with faces that had stood in the sun and fought fires and signed papers. Doña Candida arranged Elena's hair in a simple braid. Don Joaquin sharpened knives as a gift. Pedro brought a loaf baked in a wood oven. The ceremony was brief and sincere, an exchange of vows not spoken at great length, but said as if they were a statement of work to be done together. Raphael's eyes were steady and bright. Elena's were clear. He placed the gold ring on her finger, and she slipped her grandmother's ring next to it, the two circles aligning like small constellations. After the vows, they walked back to Tres Arroyos under a crowd that clapped hands and hugged backs. the porch filled with conversation and bread, and a music that had been lent by a neighbor who could play a thin violin. It was not the courtship of novels. It was the domestic joy of a community that had held on to its dignity. Years came as years do, not announced but obvious in the changing of hair and in the sound of children's feet. Miguel came first, a boy with Raphael's eyes and Elena's quick hand. Clara followed, a thoughtful child who listened as if learning to measure the world before she spoke. Later, Tomas arrived, a quiet child with a laugh that sounded like a bell in early sun. They grew under a roof that bore the marks of mending, new boards in the porch, a painted swing hanging from the eaves, the suitcase now tucked away, but never truly lost. Elena taught the village's little ones to read in a spare room of the house, turning what had been a study into a place of learning. Raphael helped men with new crop rotations and with cooperative plans for storing grain. He had learned to see power as something to share rather than hoard. The cooperative grew as a practical thing. Pooled seed, a shared barn insured against small calamities, a rule that any land sold in the valley must offer first right to neighbors, so speculators could not buy in stealth. It was not a dramatic redistribution, but a careful knotting together of interests that left fewer holes for men like Damasco to exploit. Don Cristobal's barn was rebuilt thicker, its beams blessed by Padre Tomas and the hands that had fought the fire years earlier. Through it all, the suitcase remained an emblem. It traveled sometimes in the back of a cart to the city, when Elena would send a note to the paper about an educational fair, or coax a teacher to bring books. At other times, when they would stand at the porch and watch the sun turn the orchard gold, she would take the suitcase down and untie the blue cloth, where the rings had once been wrapped, and lay them gently in the hollow of its lid, as if the small, circled things of life needed to be seen now and then. Raphael's grief softened into a presence rather than a weight. He would touch Isabel's portrait in the study and whisper a greeting. He would plant a sapling in the orchard each year, not as a memorial only, but as a habit of renewing. Elena, whose education had once been a ticket out of the valley, used it instead as a lever. She organized nights where men and women learned to read letters, to sign legal papers, and to count seed. Her teaching had small triumphs. A woman who had never written her name now signed land papers with a steady hand. A boy who had been content to follow labor began to learn about irrigation. The house at Tres Arroyos became a place where knowledge passed like bread. Their children learned the code of work and grace together. Miguel helped his father with fences and harvests. Clara sat with Elena and read by the kitchen lamp. Tomas chased chickens and learned how to mend a net. In the evenings, the family would gather on the porch. Sometimes guests from town stayed for supper and were fed with simple dishes that held the taste of the valley, stews and tortillas, and the smell of fresh masa. Doña Candida remained a fixture, her laugh a thread in the house's domestic tapestry. She aged with the property, and when she died, the house mourned as if someone had taken the house's most important room. They buried her with a small cross, and with the knowledge that the habits she had taught were now in other hands. Time did not heal in one tidal wash, but in 1,000 small acts. Raphael learned to accept help without feeling that he had somehow been diminished. Elena learned to rest in a marriage that asked of her both to lead and to follow. The valley's scars slowly paled. Damasco, reduced in public clout, retreated to lesser parishes of power. His name remained a story to teach children about greed and the price of losing sight of community. The cooperative store recorded months of surpluses and shares. The judge who had once presided over the inquiry returned to see how repairs had been made. On an autumn afternoon, years after the first rains and the first fire, Raphael and Elena sat on the same porch rail where they had first kissed as a true pair. Their hair had silver at the temples, and their hands bore age's small lines. Miguel, now a man of 22, leaned against the post with a sack of seed slung over his shoulder. Clara had a small boy in her arms who watched the orchard with wide, curious eyes. Tomas, older and steadier, spoke to neighbors about the new method for soil rotation. The porch creaked under them like a contented animal. Elena reached for her old suitcase. It had been patched at the corner and had other things inside now. Loose letters, a child's wooden horse, the blue cloth that had once wrapped the grandmother's ring. She let the cloth lie open and turned the rings in her palm, his gold circlet and her grandmother's oval. The metal glinted with the soft patina of years lived. "Do you ever miss the city?" Miguel asked his mother, honest as only children are. "Sometimes," she said, and the answer was not a regret but a measure. "It taught me certain things, but here—" She spread her hand to the orchard, to the workers repairing a fence in the distance, to the children who ran like small, fierce weather. "Here I learned to turn what I know into what others can share." Raphael leaned his head against hers and felt the map of the house in her hair, the small silver threads, the scent of lavender from a sachet. "You have given me life," he murmured. "And you have given me a place," she answered. "A place where the suitcase gets closed and the ring grows with years instead of being only a memory." They sat quiet for a while, the way people who have done their work do when they are content. Not complacent, but satisfied with the seam they have stitched between themselves and the world. The orchard's wind sighed, carrying the smell of ripening fruit, and the far murmur of a market where villagers traded with the steady confidence of a people who had been taught to stand. Night fell slowly, and with the ordinary grace of evening. At the porch's edge a lantern lit, and the house threw out a warm, steady circle. Elena tucked the suitcase under the bed that night and set the rings on the dressing table. She lay awake for a while, listening to Raphael's even breathing, and to the soft rustle of a world at peace. On a last ordinary morning when the orchard held its breath for harvest, they walked the lane together, hands clasped in the easy way of years. The valley spread around them, fields and fences and the small solidarity that made it possible to plant with faith. Children waved from a distance. The cooperative's barn stood straight and grateful in the sunlight. When they reached the porch, they paused and looked at the house that had once been a closed book and had become instead an open ledger, full of work and repair and the slow making of home. "What would you tell your younger self?" Elena asked, in that voice that asked not for answers but for the pleasure of speech. Raphael took a slow breath, thinking of a man who had once measured his life in ledgers and had learned to measure it in people. "I would tell him to let someone in," he said, "that the keeping of grief is not always courage, that love, when measured by care and work, is a fortification." She smiled and, as if to seal the lesson in small domestic ritual, she put her hand against his and felt the ring that had begun as a family token and become a shared covenant. The suitcase, the ring, the porch, motifs of a life that had been rebuilt not by heroics but by continuous humble acts, hung about them like the quiet decorations of a life well lived. At the edge of the property where the road met the valley, a small plaque had been placed years before, simple and honest. Tres Arroyos, where work and dignity have hands. People passing would nod, and some would remember the fires, and some would not. But the children who had once watched the flames from a cautious distance now learned in a schoolroom about laws and rights and the way to file a witness statement. The story of the wealthy widower and the abandoned girl, who had come with one suitcase and a name the road had not known before, became a lesson the valley told around night fires. A lesson about how two people, with a community at their back, could keep a place from breaking. When the evening wound down, Raphael and Elena sat for a long time on the porch, the swing moving gently between them. Their hands rested on their knees. The rings shone a small private light. Above them, the orchard settled, and the stars took their places like a patient audience. Elena thought of her father's folded note, of the courage that made her leave, and of how in time, courage is often repaid in the simple coin of belonging. Raphael thought of Isabel, and of the life he had almost refused to risk. Both knew that loss never truly fades. It becomes part of the woodwork, a grain that gives the house its character. Before they turned in, Raphael rose and fetched the blue cloth from the little drawer where Elena kept the old things. He wrapped it around the two rings and tucked them into her hand. "For safekeeping," he said, not ceremonious but with the warmth that had become his language. Elena closed her fingers around the cloth. "For safekeeping," she echoed. The house was quiet and full. They listened to the night and to the breathing of a valley that had learned to watch for the shape of its own courage. In the morning there would be work, as there had always been. Fences to mend, lessons to teach, seeds to count. But there would also be laughter, and the small, steady love that had been built on mending, bread, and the patience to testify. If this tale of second chances touched you, like and share, and check the channel for more true-to-heart stories.